Most people hear the word DEFCON and imagine a dramatic countdown to nuclear war. In practice, DEFCON is better understood as a command framework, a structured way for the United States military to translate rising danger into changes in readiness, surveillance, force posture, and decision speed. It is not a public alarm system, and it is not simply a five-step ladder to apocalypse. It is an internal management tool for organizing how a massive defense institution reacts when uncertainty begins to harden into threat. At the broadest level, DEFCON exists to solve a logistical problem. The US military operates across continents, time zones, and domains, with forces at sea, in the air, on land, in space-linked support networks, and inside global command systems. Those forces cannot move from routine peacetime schedules to crisis response by improvisation alone. They need a shared readiness language. DEFCON provides that language by linking intelligence assessments, political decision-making, and operational posture into a common scale that commanders can act on quickly. At its lowest level, the system reflects normal peacetime operations, training cycles, maintenance windows, scheduled deployments, and long-range planning. As the level rises, the emphasis shifts. Intelligence collection becomes more intense. Security hardens, units shorten response times. Strategic assets move closer to immediate use. The closer the system gets to its highest levels, the less it is about routine military administration, and the more it becomes a framework for managing the possibility of major war, including nuclear conflict. What makes DEFCON significant is not only what it says about danger, but what it does to institutions. It compresses timelines, changes command behavior, and sends signals to adversaries and allies alike. In other words, DEFCON is not just a measure of fear. It is a mechanism for converting threat perception into organized national power. But to understand how that mechanism works, the first layer to examine is the baseline itself, what normal readiness actually looks like before any crisis begins. To understand the higher DEFCON levels, it helps to begin at the bottom. DEFCON 5 is often misunderstood as a state of inactivity, as if the military is simply waiting for a crisis to appear. In reality, this is the baseline condition for a permanent global force. It is the level at which the United States manages routine readiness, training personnel, maintaining equipment, rotating deployments, monitoring adversaries, and preserving the command networks that would be needed if conditions changed suddenly. Structurally, DEFCON 5 is less about calm than about controlled preparation. Combatant commands continue to operate. Intelligence agencies and military surveillance systems still collect data across the world. Strategic forces remain organized under established chains of command, while conventional units conduct exercises, logistics planning, and equipment inspections. Aircraft are serviced, crews are certified, submarines patrol on schedule, and command centers rehearse procedures long before those procedures are needed in a real emergency. This matters because readiness is expensive, and no military can keep every unit at maximum alert indefinitely. DEFCON 5 allows the system to preserve capability without exhausting people or machinery. Personnel can train methodically instead of rushing. Maintenance can happen on schedule instead of being deferred. Commanders can evaluate capability gaps, update war plans, and refine coordination between services. In other words, the lowest DEFCON level is what makes the higher levels possible. A force that cannot function efficiently in peacetime cannot scale effectively in crisis. Historically, this baseline has never meant strategic blindness. Even during periods that appeared stable on the surface, the United States continued to watch missile developments, force movements, cyber activity, and political shocks that could alter military calculations with little warning. DEFCON 5 is therefore not the absence of danger. It is the organizational setting in which danger is continuously measured. But once that measurement starts to show mounting pressure, the system moves beyond routine management. The next layer is where readiness begins to tighten, and where intelligence warnings start changing the behavior of the force itself. The first real shift in the system begins before the public would notice anything unusual. DEFCON 4 is the stage where routine monitoring starts giving way to heightened caution. It does not mean war is imminent. It means military planners see enough instability, ambiguity, or adversary activity to justify tightening the readiness framework. The machinery is still operating in a controlled way, but the tolerance for delay begins to shrink. At this level, the change is often most visible in intelligence and security activity rather than dramatic troop movement. Surveillance assets may be tasked more aggressively. Communications security can be tightened. Command centers may increase staffing or review contingency procedures with greater urgency. Units that were operating on ordinary timelines may be told to verify equipment status, confirm personnel availability, and prepare for a faster transition if conditions continue to deteriorate. The key feature of DEFCON 4 is not spectacle, it is administrative acceleration. That makes this level strategically important. Large military organizations do not pivot instantly. Before aircraft disperse, submarines alter patrol emphasis, or commanders shorten launch timelines. Thousands of smaller checks have to occur first. Fuel, munitions, crews, maintenance records, secure communications, and intelligence reporting all have to align. DEFCON 4 is where the system begins reducing friction. It is the stage that converts a peacetime posture into a more responsive structure without yet imposing the strain of full-scale emergency readiness. Historically, this kind of transition has mattered most during periods of unclear escalation, when an adversary's intentions were uncertain but potentially serious. In that environment, moving too slowly can create vulnerability, while moving too aggressively can generate unnecessary escalation. DEFCON 4 sits in that narrow middle ground. It is designed to buy time, sharpen awareness, and prepare options before leaders commit to more consequential moves. But information alone does not stabilize a crisis. Once warning indicators become stronger, the system must do more than observe. It has to begin changing the tempo of actual forces. And that is where the next threshold becomes far more operational. The system becomes visibly more serious at DEFCON 3. This is the point where readiness is no longer defined mainly by internal checks and intelligence emphasis. It begins to affect the operating rhythm of real military forces. Response times shorten, alert procedures intensify, and commands prepare for the possibility that a crisis could expand quickly. It is still not the threshold of immediate war, but it is no longer a quiet precaution. The military starts behaving as though a rapid deterioration is plausible. Structurally, DEFCON 3 matters because it pushes readiness into the operational layer. Air forces may be placed on much shorter notice. Command posts increase their tempo. Strategic communications are monitored and protected with greater urgency. Some units review dispersal plans, adjust crew rotations, and prepare aircraft, ships, or missile support systems for faster execution. The emphasis is not yet on immediate release of force, but on compressing the time between warning and action. In a large organization, that compression changes everything. A useful way to understand DEFCON 3 is as a test of institutional agility. It reveals whether logistics, command authority, and personnel systems can function under pressure without breaking. Maintenance backlogs become more consequential. Communications failures become less tolerable. Decision chains that seemed acceptable in peacetime can suddenly look too slow. The level is therefore not just about external threats. It is also about whether the military itself can move from planning mode into credible execution mode. Historically, one of the most cited examples came during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, when the United States raised its readiness posture amid concerns about possible Soviet involvement. That episode showed how DEFCON changes can serve both internal and external purposes. Internally, they accelerate force readiness. Externally, they signal resolve, capability, and willingness to escalate if necessary. In that sense, DEFCON 3 is not only a practical adjustment, it is also a strategic message. But signaling alone is not enough when leaders believe a confrontation may move beyond fast mobilization and into immediate military contingency. At that point, the system must prepare forces not just to respond quickly, but to operate on the edge of direct execution. That is where DEFCON 2 begins. DEFCON 2 is the level where the system stops preparing in general terms and starts preparing for immediate strategic use. This is often described as being one step below nuclear war, but that phrase can obscure what the level actually does. Its core function is to place selected forces in a state where execution timelines become extremely short. The concern is no longer whether a crisis is serious. The concern is whether national command authorities may soon need forces that are fully positioned, fully connected, and ready to act with minimal delay. At this stage, the structure of readiness narrows. Not every military unit is treated the same way. Strategic forces, airborne assets, command and control networks, missile crews, and key support elements become central. Communications must remain secure, redundant, and immediate. Aircraft may be placed on very high alert. Crews may remain close to launch positions. Intelligence reporting is scrutinized continuously because a misread signal at DEFCON 2 could distort decisions at the most dangerous possible moment. The system becomes less about broad military flexibility and more about preserving a credible ability to execute critical missions on command. This level places enormous weight on command discipline. When timelines shrink to minutes or hours, ambiguity becomes a strategic liability. Orders have to move through hardened channels. Authentication procedures have to work without hesitation. Support systems, from radar to early warning to airborne command posts, have to remain reliable under pressure. DEFCON 2 therefore measures more than military strength. It measures whether the state can keep control of its own most sensitive capabilities while the margin for error nearly disappears. The closest widely cited example came during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when U.S. Strategic Air Command was raised to DEFCON 2. That moment demonstrated the purpose of the level with unusual clarity. The United States was not simply displaying alarm, it was positioning strategic forces so that deterrence would be credible if the confrontation escalated further. DEFCON 2 is designed for exactly that kind of crisis, one where war is still avoidable, but only if readiness itself helps prevent the next step. And that final step is the most misunderstood of all, because DEFCON 1 is less a standing condition than the threshold where readiness ends and execution begins. DEFCON 1 is commonly imagined as a permanent switch that turns on at the moment war begins. In reality, it is better understood as the threshold at which maximum readiness converges with actual execution. This is not simply a higher state of alert than DEFCON 2. It is the point where command systems, strategic forces, and operational timelines are aligned for immediate wartime action. At that stage, the distinction between preparing for conflict and conducting it becomes extremely thin. Structurally, DEFCON 1 would place extraordinary pressure on the entire command architecture. National leadership, senior military commanders, early warning systems, and nuclear command and control networks would all have to function without interruption. Authentication procedures, communication security, continuity plans, and force survivability would become essential at every level. Strategic bombers, missile crews, submarines, and airborne command posts would no longer be operating in a posture designed to warn or deter alone. They would be positioned inside an environment where decisions could produce immediate military consequences. That is why DEFCON 1 is so rarely discussed in practical terms. Its significance lies not only in force readiness, but in the collapse of decision time. Leaders may have only moments to interpret warning data, confirm intentions, preserve command continuity, and issue lawful orders. Every supporting layer matters: radar networks, satellite inputs, hardened communications, backup command centers, and pre-planned response options. The system, at this point, is no longer trying to create flexibility. It is trying to preserve control under the most compressed and dangerous conditions imaginable. Public history offers no confirmed example of the United States openly reaching DEFCON 1, and that absence is revealing. The system is designed so that deterrence, signaling, and escalation management prevent a crisis from crossing that final boundary. In that sense, DEFCON 1 is less a practical routine than a doctrinal endpoint. The outer limit, the rest of the structure exists to avoid. But readiness levels alone do not explain how such a system functions. A scale is only useful if someone has the authority to interpret threats, transmit decisions, and coordinate the vast machinery beneath it. To understand DEFCON fully, the next step is to examine the chain of command that turns alert status into action. DEFCON may look like a simple numbered scale, but the numbers mean very little without the authority structure behind them. Alert status does not rise automatically because a radar system detects something unusual or because a regional commander feels uneasy. The system only works because it is embedded in a strict chain of command that connects intelligence analysis, civilian leadership, senior military authority, and operational execution. In other words, DEFCON is not just a readiness ladder, it is a decision ladder. At the top of that structure sits the National Command Authority, centered on the President and the Secretary of Defense, with senior military leadership translating policy decisions into executable orders. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff advises combatant commanders, assess regional and strategic risks, and specialized commands maintain the forces that would be affected by any alert change. This matters because a shift in DEFCON is never purely tactical. It carries political meaning, diplomatic consequences, and strategic signals that extend far beyond any one service branch. Beneath that top layer, the system depends on disciplined transmission. Orders have to move through secure communications channels to commands responsible for nuclear forces, air defense, global mobility, intelligence support, and conventional readiness. Each layer must know not only what the new condition is, but what it requires in practice. Some units may increase watch rotations, others may harden facilities, reposition assets, or shorten response timelines. The same DEFCON change can produce very different actions across different parts of the military, because readiness is distributed through a specialized hierarchy, not applied as a single uniform switch. This command structure became especially important during the Cold War, when false alarms, fragmented data, or local misinterpretation could have had strategic consequences. Centralized authority was designed to reduce the risk that fear, confusion, or incomplete reporting would trigger uncontrolled escalation. DEFCON, in that sense, is as much about preventing accidental action as enabling deliberate action. But a command chain is only as good as the information moving through it. Before leaders can raise or lower readiness, they need a constant stream of surveillance, analysis, and warning data to tell them what kind of threat they may actually be facing. That leads to the intelligence architecture underneath the system. A readiness system is only as reliable as the warning system feeding it. DEFCON levels do not change in a vacuum. Behind every shift in posture is a dense intelligence architecture designed to detect, verify, and interpret signs of danger before military forces are told to move. That architecture includes satellites, radar networks, signals interception, reconnaissance platforms, cyber monitoring, diplomatic reporting, and human analysis. The point is not simply to gather information. It is to reduce uncertainty fast enough for decision-makers to act before a threat becomes unmanageable. Structurally, this is where the system becomes less visible and more complex. Early warning satellites look for missile launches, ground-based radar tracks, trajectories, and air activity. Intelligence agencies collect signals, imagery, and human reporting that may reveal force mobilization, nuclear preparations, command changes, or unusual military logistics. Analysts then compare those fragments against known patterns, past exercises, and adversary doctrine. A single indicator rarely means much on its own. DEFCON-related decisions depend on whether multiple sources begin pointing toward the same conclusion. That process is designed to solve one of the hardest problems in national security, distinguishing real escalation from noise. Adversaries conduct exercises. Missile units move for maintenance. Aircraft disperse for reasons that have nothing to do with imminent conflict. A state that overreacts to every ambiguous signal becomes unstable. A state that ignores warning indicators becomes vulnerable. The intelligence layer beneath DEFCON exists to manage that tension by filtering raw data into actionable assessment, ideally without distorting either the danger or the uncertainty. History has shown why this matters. During the Cold War, false alarms and technical errors occasionally suggested attacks that were not real. Those episodes exposed how dangerous compressed decision time can be when warning systems are imperfect. The value of intelligence in the DEFCON structure is therefore not just speed. It is disciplined verification under pressure. But information, however accurate, does not move forces by itself. Once threat assessments harden into operational concern, the system needs the physical means to reposition personnel, hardware, and support networks across the globe. That is where the logistical framework becomes decisive. Warning systems and command authority may define a DEFCON shift, but logistics determine whether that shift can be sustained. A military can shorten timelines on paper far faster than it can move fuel, munitions, crews, spare parts, communications equipment, and maintenance support into the right places. That is why readiness is ultimately a logistical problem. The more serious the alert level, the more the system depends on transportation networks, prepositioned stockpiles, hardened facilities, and global supply chains that are usually invisible to the public. At a structural level, this means DEFCON is not only about elite strategic units. It also relies on airlift commands, sea lift capacity, depot maintenance, tanker fleets, secure communications nodes, and base infrastructure across multiple regions. Aircraft placed on higher alert need fuel, weapons handling teams, and protected runways. Naval forces need resupply and coordinated routing. Missile and air defense networks depend on uninterrupted technical support. Even command centers require backup power, secure data links, and personnel rotations that can continue under stress. Readiness becomes real only when these support layers hold together. This is where the scale of the U.S. military matters. Because the United States maintains overseas bases, alliance access, prepositioned equipment, and global transport capability, it can translate warning into movement more effectively than many rivals. But that capacity is never automatic. Logistics planners have to decide what moves first, what remains in place, what can be sustained, and what risks emerge if transportation corridors are threatened. A higher DEFCON level therefore tests not just speed, but endurance. The question is not whether forces can surge once. It is whether they can remain credible for as long as the crisis lasts. Modern military operations have repeatedly reinforced this lesson. Precision weapons, advanced aircraft, and strategic signaling attract attention, but prolonged readiness depends on the quieter machinery underneath: supply discipline, maintenance capacity, infrastructure resilience, and distribution planning. In that sense, logistics is not secondary to deterrence. It is one of its foundations. But moving forces and sustaining them is only part of the equation. In a serious crisis, commanders also need specialized systems that can survive disruption, protect decision-makers, and keep orders flowing even if normal infrastructure comes under direct pressure. That next layer is command and control resilience. As readiness rises, the most important question is not only whether forces can move, but whether leaders can still control them under pressure. That is the purpose of command and control resilience. DEFCON assumes that in a serious crisis, an adversary may try to disrupt communications, blind sensors, degrade networks, or isolate decision-makers. If the chain connecting warning, leadership, and military execution fails, the readiness level becomes almost meaningless. The system therefore depends on protected channels that can survive confusion, distance, and potentially direct attack. Structurally, this layer includes hardened command centers, airborne command posts, redundant communications paths, secure authentication systems, and continuity procedures designed to preserve lawful authority in extreme conditions. Ground facilities can be reinforced and dispersed. Aircraft designed for command missions can remain airborne to ensure national leadership retains contact with strategic forces. Submarines provide survivable platforms less vulnerable to a sudden first strike. Even the routing of messages matters because the network must continue working. If satellites are degraded, terrestrial lines are damaged, or regional headquarters are cut off. This is where the logic of deterrence becomes technical. An adversary is less likely to gamble on escalation if it believes U.S. command systems will remain functional under attack. Resilience is therefore not just a defensive feature, it is part of the message. A state that can absorb disruption and still maintain control over its forces is harder to intimidate, harder to paralyze, and harder to mislead. DEFCON gains credibility only when that underlying control structure is believable. Cold War planning made this especially clear. As missile speeds reduced decision time, the United States invested heavily in systems that could preserve communication between civilian leaders and strategic commanders, even during the opening phase of a major conflict. The objective was not simply survival, it was controlled survival. maintaining enough connectivity to prevent chaos, accidental escalation, or unauthorized use. But even resilient command networks are only one side of readiness. The other side is human. Operators, analysts, pilots, missile crews, and commanders must be trained to function inside these systems without panic, delay, or improvisation. That means the next layer of DEFCON is built not from machines, but from disciplined personnel and constant rehearsal. A readiness framework can raise alert levels, move assets, and secure communications, but none of that matters if the people inside the system cannot operate under pressure. That is why DEFCON depends on constant training. The public often imagines readiness as a condition created in the moment of crisis. In reality, much of it is built months and years earlier through drills, certification programs, simulation exercises, maintenance discipline, and repeated rehearsal of rare but high-consequence procedures. Structurally, this training is highly specialized. Missile crews rehearse authentication and launch protocols. Pilots train for rapid generation, dispersal, and extended alert operations. Command staff practice decision flows, message handling, and coordination across multiple headquarters. Intelligence personnel drill, warning analysis, and crisis reporting. Support units train on fueling, weapons loading, runway repair, communications continuity, and base defense. These are not generic military skills. They are narrow, procedural competencies designed to function when time is compressed and mistakes carry strategic consequences. This constant rehearsal serves two purposes. First, it reduces friction. A force that has repeated the same crisis procedures many times is less likely to lose time to uncertainty or confusion. Second, it creates institutional predictability. Leaders need confidence that when an alert order is issued, different units across different regions will interpret it consistently and act within known timelines. DEFCON works because training standardizes behavior across a massive organization that would otherwise respond unevenly under stress. Historical practice has repeatedly reinforced this point. During the Cold War and after, the United States relied on exercises ranging from command post simulations to live force readiness drills to test whether warning systems, command channels, and operational units could perform together as a single mechanism. Those exercises were not symbolic. They exposed delays, technical failures, and procedural weaknesses that had to be corrected before any real crisis emerged. But trained personnel do not operate in isolation. Their effectiveness depends on the broader technological environment around them, from early warning sensors to secure networks to delivery systems. Once training establishes reliable human performance, the next layer to examine is the technology that extends speed, reach, and precision across the entire readiness architecture. Technology gives DEFCON its speed. Without modern sensors, secure networks, precision delivery systems, and automated warning tools, alert levels would remain largely administrative. What turns readiness into usable capability is the technological layer linking detection, communication, mobility, and strike capacity into one operational framework. In a high-pressure environment, that integration matters more than any single platform. The real advantage comes from how quickly the system can collect information, authenticate it, distribute it, and turn it into coordinated action. Structurally, this layer begins with sensing and processing. Satellites watch for missile launches and track changes in force posture. Radar systems extend detection across long distances. Secure communications networks transmit orders and warnings through multiple pathways. Aircraft, submarines, missile systems, and support platforms are tied into this wider architecture so they can receive updated instructions and operate inside a shared strategic picture. Even cyber defense now plays a role, because a readiness system that relies on digital infrastructure must protect itself against intrusion, spoofing, and disruption. This technological ecosystem changes the meaning of time. In earlier eras, warning and response were slowed by distance, limited communications, and incomplete visibility. In the modern environment, leaders may receive data almost immediately, but that speed introduces its own risks. Faster information can reduce vulnerability, yet it can also compress decision windows and increase pressure to interpret ambiguous signals quickly. Technology, therefore, improves readiness while also making discipline more important. A faster system is only safer if its operators can distinguish reliable warning from noise. The broader historical shift has been clear. DEFCON emerged in a world defined by bombers and early nuclear planning, but it now functions inside a far more connected battlespace shaped by satellites, networked command systems, cyber operations, and precision strike platforms. That evolution has made the framework more flexible, but also more dependent on technical resilience across many domains at once. And that leads to a larger strategic point. DEFCON is not only a domestic command tool or a military readiness code. Every change in posture is also read by allies, competitors, and adversaries abroad. To understand its full significance, the next layer is the international signaling function built into the system itself. At the highest level, DEFCON is also a signaling system. It is designed to organize U.S. readiness internally, but it also communicates externally whether Washington believes a crisis is manageable, deteriorating, or nearing a threshold that could alter the strategic balance. Allies watch for reassurance. Adversaries watch for intent and resolve. Competitors watch for signs of weakness, overreaction, or political hesitation. In that sense, a DEFCON shift is never interpreted only by the military units receiving the order. It is interpreted across the international system. Structurally, this signaling effect works because readiness changes produce observable consequences. Surveillance activity increases. Strategic aircraft patterns may shift. Naval deployments can become more visible. Diplomatic messaging tightens. Allied consultations accelerate. Even when the exact DEFCON level is not publicly disclosed, fragments of posture change can still be detected by foreign intelligence services and political leadership. The signal is therefore not only what the United States says, it is what the broader defense system begins to do. This makes DEFCON a tool of deterrence as much as a tool of administration. If an adversary believes the United States can raise readiness quickly, preserve command integrity, and sustain forces under pressure, the costs of aggression appear higher. But signaling has to be carefully calibrated. A move that is too weak may fail to deter. A move that is too abrupt may be misread as preparation for attack. That is why DEFCON exists inside a wider framework of diplomacy, alliance management, intelligence sharing, and strategic communication. The number alone is never the whole message. Cold War crises illustrated this clearly, but the logic remains relevant in a more complex, international environment. Today, signaling may involve not only nuclear forces, but cyber posture, missile defense readiness, regional force deployments, and alliance coordination across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. DEFCON still matters because it compresses these variables into a recognizable scale of seriousness. But the modern security environment is no longer defined by one rival or one domain of conflict. To understand where DEFCON fits now, the final step is to examine its long-term role in a world shaped by cyber threats, space dependence, regional flashpoints, and constant strategic ambiguity. In the modern era, DEFCON is less a relic of Cold War nuclear planning than a durable framework for managing extreme uncertainty. Its lasting value is not that it predicts war, but that it organizes response when warning signs multiply faster than normal political and military routines can absorb them. It gives leaders a structured way to scale vigilance, compress timelines, protect command systems, and signal seriousness without immediately crossing into direct conflict. In that sense, DEFCON remains relevant because the underlying problem it solves has not disappeared. Large military systems still need a common readiness language when crises accelerate. What has changed is the environment surrounding that language. During the Cold War, the central concern was often a relatively narrow, strategic confrontation dominated by nuclear forces and superpower competition. Today, the United States faces a more fragmented landscape: cyber attacks that may precede physical conflict, anti-satellite threats that could disrupt warning and communications, regional flashpoints that can escalate quickly, and adversaries capable of operating below the threshold of open war. That complexity makes readiness harder to define. A crisis may begin in digital networks, commercial shipping lanes, or contested airspace long before it resembles the older image of strategic alert. This means DEFCON now operates inside a broader ecosystem of deterrence and crisis management. It has to coexist with alliance consultation, cyber defense, missile warning, space resilience, and rapid global logistics. The numbered scale still matters, but its meaning depends increasingly on how well it integrates with systems that were less central when the framework first emerged. The real challenge is not preserving the vocabulary. It is adapting the machinery behind it to threats that are faster, less predictable, and often harder to attribute. That is the strategic reality. DEFCON endures because states still need a disciplined way to convert danger into organized action. But its future effectiveness will depend on whether the United States can maintain credible control in an era when warning may be ambiguous, escalation may be multi-domain, and the first signs of crisis may appear everywhere at once. The system was built to manage pressure. Its next test is whether it can manage complexity on the same scale.